I partnered with my uncle in the seafood wholesale business. We made a net profit of 2.85 million in a year. At the end of the year, when it was time to split the profits, he only tossed me 120,000. He told me, the stall is mine, and I put up the starting capital. You just put in the labor, so 120,000 isn't a small amount. I didn't say a word. I just pocketed that money, which wasn't even a fraction of his earnings. I looked at him and said, fine, I'll do as you say. He thought I was a fool who would be his cheap labor forever. He had no idea that with that money, I immediately rented the large cold storage unit right across from him. Seeing his face turn pale, I lowered the shutter and said, Uncle, from now on, we go our separate ways. They say he stayed at the stall until dawn that night, hitting his calculator nonstop. The figure for the year was 2.85 million. A year has 365 days. We both worked shifts and then said our goodbyes. The figure for the year was 2.85 million. A year has 365 days. We both worked shifts and then said our goodbyes. We never stopped for a moment, constantly watching the seafood tanks. The total cash flow was over 5 million. The net profit reached 2.9 million minus a few thousand. The 2.85 million figure was correct. The stall was mine. I provided the capital, and I was the one who managed the relationships with the big hotels. You only put in the effort. He looked at me and continued, don't look at me like that. If I hired a helper, 10,000 a month would be the limit, plus I'd have to cover food, housing, and social security. This 120,000 is your savings. It's not a small amount, not even counting wear and tear, depreciation, and debt collection. Everything passed through my hands. I spent over 30,000 just repairing those old refrigeration machines during the year. He was right. The stall and the capital were his. But of those 2.73 million, how much was earned with the sweat of my brow and by straining my eyes? He never did that math. I said, fine, I'll do as you say. He told me, don't overthink it. On the first day of the new year, a batch of lobsters will arrive. Top quality at the port, at a good price. Go to the pier early. I didn't go home. I had the 120,000 on me. I was afraid my mother would ask how much I earned with my uncle this year and how we split the profits. I had no way to explain it. 328 per day. When we started the partnership, he told me, we're family. We'll split the profits equally. Where I eat, you eat. Before the new year, he said we'd split equally. After the new year, he said I only provided the labor. Was that all my effort was worth? Didn't he say the stall was his? Fine, then I'll have mine. I called the market's leasing supervisor about the large 500 square meter cold storage unit across the way. The rent plus the deposit was exactly 120,000. I already knew all the small clients perfectly. I could sign the contract in 3 days at most and open before the new year. That same night, I put the money on the supervisor's table. We signed the contract that night, and once I had the keys to the facility of the cold storage in my hand, I knew my fate was no longer in anyone else's hands. At 4 in the morning on the first day of the year, the wind at the pier was freezing. I arrived 2 hours earlier than usual. When the ship's captain docked, I approached him. Old Sam, I want this entire batch of lobsters. I'll pay cash on the spot. The captain was stunned. Wait, didn't your uncle already notify you? I pulled out a wad of cash. I'm working on my own now. I'm offering 5% more on the price. I'll handle the inspection and loading. You won't have to wait a single minute. The captain looked at me and stayed silent for a few seconds. When my uncle arrived at the pier, that batch of top-quality lobsters was already loaded into my refrigerated truck. He stood there on the empty pier, his face livid. What is the meaning of this? I closed the truck door. Uncle, didn't you say it yourself? To each according to his ability. Happy New Year. I wanted to start on the right foot. The car started, and in the rearview mirror, my uncle's figure grew smaller and smaller. I knew that between him and me, the conflict was finally sealed. I took the lobsters to the cold storage and sorted them all night. The merchandise was of excellent quality, every single one. They weighed over 750 grams with full claws. When I finished, I sent a message to the group of retail clients in the market. In less than half an hour, more than 10 people gathered in front of the cold storage. They were all contacts I had cultivated throughout the year. I remember exactly who had difficulties in every one of those favors. After inspecting the merchandise, the retailers placed their orders. I sold at market price without markups or hoarding. In 2 hours, the whole batch of lobsters was gone. I made a net profit of 43,000 and recovered my initial investment. My cold storage facility officially began operations. At 10 in the morning, I received a call from my uncle. I didn't answer. Immediately after, rumors started spreading through the market. He fought with his uncle and opened his own stall. My uncle issued a threat. Whoever dares to do business with him can forget about getting merchandise from me in the future. After offending his uncle, how could I survive in this market? By noon, the retailers started calling to cancel their orders. They all spoke with a tone of urgency, saying they had problems at home and wouldn't buy merchandise for now. I understood what was happening. I didn't say another word and returned their deposits in full. At 3 in the afternoon, my uncle appeared with several old stall owners and blocked the entrance to my cold storage. Pointing his finger at me, he called me ungrateful. He said he brought me from the countryside, taught me the business hand to hand, and that I repaid him poorly. People began to surround us, all looking for a show. I didn't argue with him about the $120,000. I just asked him calmly what he wanted. My uncle was left speechless, but finally threw out a threat, saying that the ship captains and big clients wouldn't dare do business with me, and I'd soon realize I was finished. The other owners followed him, and the crowd slowly dispersed. The whispers didn't stop. I stood in front of the cold storage, watching their backs without flinching. I've been fighting for a year. In this market, which boat docks and when, which retailer needs what merchandise, I know it better than anyone. My uncle thinks he controls my life, but he doesn't know that true relationships are earned through effort, not maintained through threats. That night, I hung my sign, morning products. Wholesale. Those 5 large characters stared directly at my uncle's stall, flashing under the night lights. I also posted a notice at the market entrance. Hiring an operator. Salary of $12,000 a month, including room, board, and social security. If you work well, there are year-end bonuses. The next morning, a young man named Leo came to apply for the position. He had just left his hometown to work, and in his eyes, I saw the same longing I had years ago. I looked at his calloused hands. He was someone capable of enduring hard work. I hired him on the spot and told him to start in the afternoon. After Leo left, I stayed in the cold storage, checking the inventory, the refrigeration. Machines hummed, and the temperature held steady at 5 degrees below zero. I watched my uncle's stall across the way. It was lit up, full of people coming and going. It looked like a prosperous business, but I knew that without me, those old refrigeration machines wouldn't last long. Last summer, when it was hottest, he only knew how to keep the books. He only knew how to negotiate relationships. I took out my phone and opened my contact list. I had the numbers of over a dozen ship captains from other ports, all met during this year of work. My uncle thought cutting the local supply would suffocate me. He doesn't know how this world works. The world is huge, and there isn't only one dock outside this cold storage unit. At night, I lowered the metal shutter and turned the key. Tomorrow at 3 a.m., I drive. I'll go 200 kilometers to the North Port, where a captain promised to save me a batch of fish. On the 3rd day after opening, my mother came. She was standing in front of the cold storage, holding a thermos. Her hair was whiter than it was at New Year's. I was counting inventory with Leo, and seeing her, I almost dropped the ledger. My mother said nothing. She just placed the thermos on the table. Inside was the rib soup I like most. She looked around, observing this 500 square meter cold storage and the morning products sign hanging on the wall. Her eyes were red. I told Leo to keep working and pulled up a chair for my mother. She sat in silence for a long time until she finally asked me if it was true that I had fought with my uncle. I nodded. Soon after, my mother sighed, saying that yesterday, my uncle went to the house and cried to her for 2 hours, saying I'm ungrateful. He said that after working hard with me for a year, I stole the business and blocked his merchandise, claiming I was driving him to ruin. My mother said, your uncle asked me to convince you to transfer the cold storage to him and go back to work for him. He promises to raise your bonus, giving you $200,000 a year. I said nothing. I just took a folder from the drawer and handed it to my mother. Inside were my work records from the entire year. Every purchase invoice, every repair bill, every record of collection calls, and also the refrigerator maintenance logs. I immediately pointed out the key points marked with red pen. In July of last year, Unit 3 had a failure in the compressor. I spent 36 straight hours repairing it while my uncle played cards in the air-conditioned room. In September, a restaurant owed $150,000. I spent half a month chasing them down just to collect it. My uncle said it was my duty. In November, the shipment arrived at 2 a.m. I unloaded 3 tons of seafood alone. I injured my back for a month, and my uncle only came to settle the accounts the next day. My mother flipped through those receipts, and her hands began to tremble. I told her that out of 365 days, taking turns with my uncle, I actually did 80% of the work. With a total turnover of over $5 million and a net profit of $2,850,000, my uncle gave me $120,000, saying I only provided the labor. My mother's tears welled up. She closed the folder, stood up, and without a word, turned and left. I knew where she was going. At 4 p.m., shouting was heard in the market. My mother was blocking the entrance to my uncle's stall. In front of everyone, she asked him how much work I had done in a year and how those $120,000 were calculated. My uncle was speechless. He didn't know how to be grateful. The stall was mine. The capital was mine. Why would he want so much? My mother mocked him after hearing this and said that when he opened the stall, she had lent him the $50,000 in startup capital. Don't you remember that debt? I worked with you for a year and haven't even paid my mother back. You gave yourself a decent salary. Is your conscience clear giving me only $120,000 at the end of the year? My uncle's face turned red. He wanted to talk back, but couldn't say a word. My mother turned and left. Passing by the door of my cold storage, she stopped, looked at me, and in her eyes there was no reproach, only pain and acceptance. She said 4 words, do a good job. That night, how to butcher, how to judge the freshness of seafood. She learned with great seriousness, taking notes and practicing. I looked at her and remembered my younger self. She told me I couldn't go to my uncle's house. Back then, I was the same. I believed if I was willing to suffer, my uncle would treat me with sincerity. Now I understand. In this world, only your own position is reliable. At 11 p.m., the stall of my uncle, right across from mine, still had the light on. Through the glass, I saw him sitting there alone, staring at the account book. The refrigerator beside him made a strange sound, and the temperature on the screen flickered, clearly unstable. I looked away and closed the warehouse door. Tomorrow there's an urgent order. I can't afford to fail. On the 5th day after opening, my supply was cut off. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I went to the dock to pick up goods as usual. Old Sam's boat had already docked. But seeing me, he shook his head. He told me, "Oh, I'm sorry. Today's goods have already been reserved in their entirety by your uncle. The price is 20% higher than the market." I froze. I turned around to look for other captains, but after asking everyone, the answer was the same. My uncle had teamed up with other big stalls, buying all the local supplies at a price 20% higher than the market. I stood on the empty dock, watching the seafood boats leave while the cigarette in my hand burned down to the filter. Returning to the warehouse, Sarah was already waiting for me. Seeing me arrive empty-handed, her face showed worry. I didn't say much. I just asked her to go rest. I sat alone in the office and checked my contact list. If the local supply is blocked, then I'll go outside. I remembered that 2 months ago, while transporting goods at the New South Dock, I met a captain named Charlie. That cargo didn't sell well at the time. It looked good, but the size was small and no local wholesaler wanted to accept it. I helped him analyze the market, suggested lowering the price for retail, and in 3 days he sold out. Leaving, old Charlie said, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." I called old Charlie's number. The phone rang for a long time before he answered. Old Charlie's voice sounded sleepy. I went straight to the point. I asked if he had goods lately. I wanted everything, paying in cash. Old Charlie stayed silent for a few seconds and asked if something happened. I didn't hide it. I told him about my uncle's blockade. After listening, old Charlie let out an insult, saying that way of acting was shameful. He told me to wait for news. After hanging up, it was already dawn. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I took the car and headed straight to the South Dock. I drove 3 hours without stopping until I reached the South Dock. It was 10 a.m. and old Charlie was already waiting for me next to a transport truck. The cargo hold was full of freshly unloaded seafood, so old Charlie took me to inspect the goods. This batch had just arrived at the port. It was coral grouper and hairy crabs, and though they weren't top grade, their freshness was excellent. The gills were still bright red, and the crab legs were strong. I made the decision instantly and bought everything, transferring the hundreds of crabs at the port. Old Charlie showed me the payment notification on his phone. He patted my shoulder and said, "You've got guts, kid. Someone like your uncle will end up badly sooner or later. From now on, you get first pick of the goods." We talked for a long time. He told me the South Dock was a new development and most local wholesalers didn't know this route yet. The supply here is stable and prices are 10% lower than in the north. The ship captains are honest, straightforward people. I felt more at ease. My uncle thought controlling the local dock would suffocate me, but he didn't realize how big the sea is. There's more than one dock. I returned to the market with the refrigerated truck packed full. Marcus was already waiting for me at the warehouse door. Seeing the truck, his eyes lit up. We unloaded all night, sorting and weighing the coral groupers and hairy crabs. The price was 5% lower than the market rate. I called several old clients. They needed the goods and placed orders right then and there. By 10 p.m. that night, more than half the load was sold, bringing in 150,000 yuan. The next morning, I drove back to the South Dock. This time, old Charlie introduced me to 2 other deep-sea captains with even more stable supplies. I negotiated a partnership, promising that as long as the quality was good, I'd pay cash on the spot. No delays. The 3 captains deliberated for a moment and finally agreed. One of them, named Miller, said, "You have a lot of courage to strike out on your own so young. You have determination. We sailors value reputation above all else. If you keep paying in cash, we'll give you priority on the supply." I shook each of their hands, finally feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. On the way back to the city, Marcus called to tell me my uncle had been outside the warehouse today, pacing around and watching us unload the money. Later that day, I met a man who called me. He asked if I had a very somber expression. A couple of retailers also came by to ask where we were getting the goods and why the price was even lower than the market. I hung up and watched the landscape fly past the window. My uncle thought raising local prices would force me out, but he didn't imagine that the more he blocked me, the wider my path became. Once the South Dock supply stabilized, my costs were 10% lower than his, and the price advantage became obvious immediately. In the end, I won't be the one backed into a corner. After stabilizing the South Dock supply, my cold storage business began to thrive. For a full week, I left at 3 a.m. to pick up cargo at the South Dock, returning to the market before 10 a.m. These products were incredibly fresh and 10% cheaper than local ones. Retailers saw the advantage, and orders kept increasing. On the 10th day, old Charlie called saying he wanted to discuss a matter, so I drove down there that same afternoon. Old Charlie took me to a food stall at the dock, ordered several dishes, and poured 2 glasses of liquor. He went straight to the point. "I think you're a reliable guy. I want to sign an exclusive supply agreement with you." I set down my chopsticks and looked at him. Old Charlie said, "There are currently 5 boats operating at the South Dock. Mine, Miller's, and Scott's. Our 3 boats cover half the volume. After watching you, I see you always pay cash. You're a pro at inspections and never complain. We've discussed it here at the dock." Old Charlie had called me to discuss a matter, so I drove there that afternoon. He went straight to the point. "I think you're a reliable guy. I want to sign an exclusive supply agreement with you." I set down my chopsticks and looked at him. Old Charlie took me to a food stall at the South Dock. Between his boat, Miller's, and Scott's, they cover half the volume. After watching me, he saw I always pay cash. I'm professional during inspections, and I never make excuses. They had consulted everyone at the South Dock. With this deal, the advantage becomes instant. I shook old Charlie's hand. We signed the agreement on the spot for a 3-month term. I guarantee a weekly volume of 200,000. They guarantee a stable supply and the best possible price after signing the contract. Old Charlie told me something else. He said lately someone has been using their contacts to find out where I get my goods. They're offering a very high price, trying to snatch this line away from me. Old Charlie said, in business, reputation is what matters. You've been loyal to us. We won't do something as low as breaking our word. But be careful. Your uncle has been operating in this area for years. He has many tricks up his sleeve. I nodded, aware of the situation. By the time I returned to the market, it was already 9 p.m. Marcus was still in the cold storage, organizing the goods. Seeing me arrive, he immediately came over to tell me that 3 more retail customers came to place orders today. Also, a restaurant owner wants to talk about a long-term collaboration. The next morning, I went to that restaurant. The owner, Mr. Lee, is in his mid-40s. He owns 2 restaurant chains in the city, and his daily seafood consumption is considerable. He told me he used to buy everything from my uncle, but lately, the rate of dead fish has been increasing. He had complained several times without seeing any improvement. I took him to the cold storage to see the goods. Mr. Lee inspected everything very carefully, from the color of the gills to the clarity of the fish's eyes. He checked every detail and finally nodded, saying the goods were truly excellent. He asked if I could guarantee a stable supply. I showed him the exclusive supply agreement from the South Dock. After reading it, Mr. Lee made the decision on the spot, saying that from now on, he'd get the seafood for both his locations from me. He will buy everything from me, at least 50,000 yuan weekly. After seeing Mr. Lee off, I stood in front of the cold storage door lighting a cigarette. At the stall across from mine, my uncle was arguing with someone. His voice was very loud, and through the glass, I could see several crates of dead fish tossed on the floor. The temperature is unstable, and a large portion of the goods is spoiling. I said nothing. I just looked across the way. I know those refrigeration machines by heart. The compressor on unit number 3 is old. The temperature must be checked every 4 hours, and the condenser on unit number 2 has a crack. As soon as the load increases in summer, it starts leaking gas. I know all these flaws. That's why last year I was able to keep the dead fish rate below 3%. But my uncle doesn't understand this. He only knows how to crunch numbers and talk about influence. He has no idea about the quirks of these machines. Without me, his stall is like a machine missing parts. It looks like it's still running, but in reality, it's already starting to collapse. That same night, the daily cash flow of my warehouse exceeded 100,000 for the first time. Marcus, excited, showed me the ledger and said, "Boss, we're definitely making a profit this month." I looked at the numbers, but I felt very calm. A 100,000 flow is nothing to my uncle. In his prime, he could do 300,000 a day. The flow from the South Dock has stabilized and big clients are starting to pile up. What comes next is slowly consuming my uncle's market share. At midnight, the light at the stall across the way was still on. My uncle sat there alone, staring at a pile of dead fish. The refrigeration machine beside him emitted a sharp, annoying noise, and the temperature on the screen fluctuated wildly. I lowered the shutter, closed the warehouse, and tomorrow at 3 a.m., I have to receive a shipment of king crabs at the South Dock. 3 weeks later, the warehouse took off. 3 weeks after signing the exclusive supply agreement, my daily cash flow stayed above 120,000. That afternoon, old Charlie called me suddenly with a grave tone. He told me someone had contacted him, offering 20% more than I was to try and buy up the South Dock supply. The other person is Frank, the person closest to my uncle in the entire market. I felt a sting. I knew my uncle was starting to play for real. Old Charlie said, "That price is really tempting. But we've talked, and in business, reputation is very good. Reputation matters. We've only had the agreement for 3 weeks. We can't just change our minds like that. I'm calling to warn you that this time your uncle is very serious." I thanked old Charlie, and that same night, I drove to the South Dock. The 3 captains were there. I invited them to dinner, and during the meal, I didn't mention the price increase. We only talked about how hard it is to go out to sea and the state of the market. Miller mentioned his son starts college next year, and he's still short on tuition. Right then, I said, "Miller, I'll pay the tuition. Consider it an advance payment for the goods. We'll deduct it slowly from future supplies." Scott said his wife was hospitalized and he was short on cash. I transferred 50,000 to him instantly and told him that money was for the emergency, and I was in no rush for him to pay it back. The 3 captains looked at me, their eyes expressing something new. Old Charlie raised his glass and said, "You're a man of your word. No matter how much more your uncle offers, we won't budge." I toasted with them, feeling at peace. By the time I returned to the market, it was very late. I sat in the office planning my next steps. The South Dock supply was stable, but my uncle won't just sit idly by. I'm afraid he'll go after the ship captains or attack from another front. Sure enough, rumors began circulating through the market. Some said my goods were contraband without quarantine certificates. Others claimed my cold storage didn't meet regulations and would be shut down any moment. They even said I wasn't related to the captain and my supply source was unstable. These rumors sounded very convincing, and soon customers started calling to ask questions. I didn't get nervous. I immediately took photos of the South Dock quarantine certificates, the cold storage business license, and the supply agreements, sending them to the retail customer group. The rumors vanished on their own, but my uncle didn't stop. Market management staff suddenly arrived to inspect the cold storage. They said they received a report. They suspected the refrigeration equipment didn't meet standards and there were risks. They demanded a halt to operations for an inspection. I was prepared before opening the warehouse. All equipment was configured to the highest standards: quarantine, fire safety, environmental protection. All certificates were in order. The inspector checked for 2 hours and couldn't find a single error. In the end, he left empty-handed. After seeing him off, Marcus lowered his voice and said, "Boss, someone just saw that it was your uncle who went to report you to the administration." I nodded. I already expected these tactics. That same afternoon, my warehouse's daily flow exceeded 150,000, officially surpassing my uncle's business, and the news spread quickly through the market. Everyone was commenting that I had truly succeeded. At sunset, a group of creditors gathered in front of my uncle's stall demanding their payments. During this time, to block my supply, my uncle hoarded goods at the local dock at high prices and allied with other stalls to drive up costs. His capital chain began to strain. The fish mortality rate stayed high, and he lost many customers. His situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Marcus said my uncle's number 3 refrigeration machine broke again today. An entire crate of king crabs died, a loss of at least 80,000. I knew that number 3 machine very well. Last summer, when it first failed, I stayed awake 36 hours straight to repair it. I know every part, every quirk. But now, it's no longer my responsibility. At nightfall, a client called. Mr. Lee called to say his friend also wanted to buy goods from me. He's the owner of another restaurant chain in the city with a weekly order of at least 70,000. I agreed to visit him the next day. After hanging up, I stood in front of the cold storage. The lights at the stall across the way were still on. Through the glass, I could see my uncle sitting there alone with a pile of bills in front of him. He seemed to have more gray hair. His figure looked strangely worn out. I looked away and closed the warehouse door. Tomorrow, a batch of wild yellow croakers must arrive. The customer already reserved 200,000 in quantity. In the market, people began to whisper in private, saying my uncle's stall wouldn't last long since his old refrigeration machines fail constantly. The fish mortality rate has risen to 15%. Many regular customers have started moving to my side. Marcus finished organizing the last batch and said excitedly, "Boss, we have a net profit of 500,000 this month." I looked at the figures in the ledger, feeling very calm. A profit of 500,000 is nothing compared to my uncle's golden age. But for me, it's the first fortune that truly belongs to me. Late at night, I closed the warehouse, ready to rest. Passing my uncle's stall, I saw he was still working, trying to repair the number 3 machine. His movements were clumsy. He clearly understood nothing about those circuits and parts. I stood watching from outside for a moment, but finally, I turned around and left. After my warehouse's daily flow stabilized at 150,000, I stayed the course. My uncle started a price war. The next morning, word suddenly spread through the market. All seafood at my uncle's stall was 20% off, a liquidation at a loss. Many retailers, hearing this, immediately ran to his stall. Marcus came to ask me, "Boss, should we lower prices too?" I shook my head. I know what my uncle is doing. He wants to ruin me with a price war, forcing me to lower prices and lose money or watch my customers leave. But he was wrong about one thing. My costs are 10% lower than his, and my supply is more stable. More importantly, I don't need to compete with him on price. I told Marcus to buy a batch of thermal boxes and refrigerated delivery vehicles. I'm going to improve the service, betting on the high-end route with zero mortality and punctual deliveries. Marcus didn't quite understand. He said everyone is competing on price now. Is this useful? I said, at the end of a price war, what matters is who lasts longer. Instead of wearing myself out with him, it's better to take another path. During the next 3 days, I didn't lower prices. On the contrary, I put all my energy into service. Before each batch leaves the warehouse, I personally check it to ensure there isn't a single dead fish. Delivery time is precise, with a 30-minute tolerance. When the customer needs the goods, I deliver them right then. At first, indeed, some retailers were lured by my uncle's low prices. But very soon, the problems began. To be able to lower prices, my uncle had to cut corners. At first, the customers were lured by my uncle's low prices, but very soon, the problems began because of those low prices. Mr. Lee called to say his friend finished his evaluation and decided to give me all his seafood orders. That's one of the largest hotel chains in the city, with a volume of at least 100,000 weekly. Mr. Lee said, "My friend had also gone to see your uncle before, but his goods aren't stable and there are too many dead fish. Although your prices are a bit higher, you have 0 dead fish and you meet the deadlines, which is what matters most for hotels." I met with Mr. Lee's friend and we signed a cooperation agreement right then. Starting next week, the 100,000 weekly order will all pass through my cold storage. I returned to the market after signing the agreement at sunset. In front of my uncle's stall, several crates of returns were piled up. Some retailers were arguing with him. My uncle's face was red with rage and his voice was hoarse. Marcus said, "Your uncle has had so many returns these past 2 days. Rumor has it he's paid over 100,000 in compensation alone." I stood at the door of my warehouse, watching the situation across the way. My uncle's price war didn't last even 10 days before starting to crumble. His capital chain was already tight, and now, selling at a loss and also paying compensation for returns, he simply couldn't sustain himself. Most fatal of all, the cheap goods he bought to lower prices completely ruined his reputation. Many old customers lost trust in him and started turning to me. That same night, my warehouse's daily flow exceeded 200,000. Marcus showed me the ledger excitedly, saying this month's net profit would exceed 800,000. My uncle thought low prices would ruin me, but he didn't know that the true defensive moat is quality and service. Late at night, the light at the stall across the way was still on. My uncle was sitting there alone with a pile of bills and return notes in front of him. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was surely creditors collecting their debts. I closed my warehouse door and prepared to rest. Tomorrow, another batch of Australian lobsters arrives. The first order from Mr. Lee's friend's hotel. I can't afford a single mistake. Walking toward the market exit, I looked back once. My uncle's stall looked particularly desolate in the dark of night, and that sign that had been hanging for over 10 years swayed in the wind, emitting a creak. In the market, whispers had already started that my uncle overreached this time. The price war didn't ruin me. It dragged him into the mud. Others said at this rate, the market was leaving him behind. In this trend, my uncle's stall wouldn't last the month. I didn't participate in those talks. I just kept doing my work in silence. The next morning, that batch of Australian lobsters arrived on time. I personally verified the goods, sorted, and distributed them, achieving a perfect end-to-end service. When Mr. Lee's friend received the goods, he added 50% more to his order on the spot. My uncle had already lost this price war. 3 days after the war ended, something important happened in the market. The city's largest buyer arrived. Mr. Zhang from the Hinding Grand Hotel arrived. He was hosting his son's wedding banquet with 300 tables, and the seafood consumption was massive. Whoever landed this order would practically secure their place in the market. Mr. Zhang's hotel has been open for 20 years and has always been the top choice for high-level banquets. For years, he always bought his seafood from my uncle. They had a very close relationship. The wedding was Saturday, and they started preparing the goods 3 days prior. My uncle bet everything on this deal to prove he was doing a good job. Mr. Zhang had almost all his capital tied up moving goods from various docks, hoping to use this opportunity to recover. On Friday afternoon, news suddenly broke in the market that something went wrong at the Hinding Grand Hotel. Marcus came running and said there was a huge problem with the seafood my uncle supplied. Half of the king crabs died, and the Australian lobsters were no longer fresh. Mr. Zhang was furious at the hotel, demanding my uncle replace the goods immediately or he would cancel the partnership. I stood in front of my cold storage and saw from afar that my uncle's stall was in total chaos. He was calling around to find goods, but it was Friday at sunset. The banquet started tomorrow at noon. There was no way to bring in goods from outside. As for the local docks, he had already offended everyone with his aggressive high-price buying, and now no one wanted to sell to him. At 6 in the evening, Mr. Zhang arrived personally at the market. He's about 50 and usually very kind, but this time his face was livid. He stood in front of my uncle's stall and, with a loud voice, said he had trusted him after so many years of cooperation, but questioned what kind of goods he delivered this time for 300 wedding banquets. The guests are important people. How is he supposed to explain this? My uncle was sweating buckets, apologizing incessantly, and saying he would find a way to replace the goods. Mr. Zhang said if he didn't deliver quality products by 10 p.m., there would be no more business between them. Mr. Zhang turned to leave and just then saw me standing in front of my cold storage door. He froze, walked over and asked if I was the owner there. I nodded, and Mr. Zhang asked directly, "Do you have stock right now? I need 50 king crabs, 80 Australian lobsters, and 100 kilos of coral grouper. Everything must be alive and in perfect condition. Could you deliver it to the restaurant before 10 p.m.? I calculated quickly. The inventory in my warehouse wasn't enough. But at the South Dock, Old Chin just received a batch today, and I know the quality well. Getting the goods from South Dock to the city and then to the Hinding restaurant is a very tight window. But it's not impossible. I said I could do it, but I had to go inspect the quality first to ensure there were no problems." Mr. Zhang looked at me in silence for a few seconds and finally nodded. He said it was his son's wedding and there could be no mistakes. I immediately called Old Chin to ask him to reserve the batch that arrived at the port today. Then I called Marcus. We loaded the refrigerated truck and went straight to the South Dock. When we arrived, it was already 7:30 p.m. Old Chin had everything ready, and I checked them one by one. I made sure they were all full of vitality. After verifying, we loaded up immediately and headed back, arriving at the market at 9 o'clock. Marcus and I sorted everything all night, not overlooking a single detail. At 9:40, the goods were loaded and we left for the Hinding restaurant. When we arrived, it was exactly 9:55. Mr. Zhang was already waiting in the kitchen and inspected everything himself. The king crabs were fresh with strong claws, and the Australian lobsters had intact antennas. They were full of water. They were full of energy, and the coral grouper had a bright red color and clear eyes. After the inspection, Mr. Zhang finally smiled. He patted me on the shoulder, saying, "Wow, this batch is perfect. You've gotten me out of a huge mess." I said it was just what I had to do. Mr. Zhang looked at me and said, "Son, you've helped me a lot this time. I'd like to talk to you about a long-term partnership later." I nodded. When I returned to the market, it was already 11 p.m., and the lights at my uncle's stall were still on. Through the glass, he could be seen sitting alone, with those dead king crabs and lobsters in front of him. His phone was on the table, its screen dark. Mr. Zhang probably wasn't answering his calls anymore. Marcus said, "Boss, your uncle is finished. The Hinding restaurant is the biggest client in the city. By losing them, he practically has no chance to recover." I didn't respond. I just closed the cold storage door. Tomorrow I still have to go to the restaurant to help ensure the wedding goes well. On Saturday, the day of the wedding, I arrived at the Hinding restaurant very early. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. I personally supervised the preparation of every seafood dish. The king crab turned out perfect, the Australian lobster sashimi was delicious, and the steamed grouper was tender. Mr. Zhang greeted guests in the hall, constantly looking toward the kitchen with a smile. At 12 p.m., the wedding began. The guests at the 300 tables praised the seafood dishes. Some business owners asked Mr. Zhang right then and there. Mr. Zhang was asked where the goods came from, and he replied with a smile, "They're supplied by a young man from the market." It's hard to say much lately. At 3 p.m., Mr. Zhang called me into his office and asked the waiter to serve us tea. He sat down, lit a cigarette, and said, "Sai, it was all thanks to you this time. Otherwise, I would have lost my entire reputation." Mr. Zhang gestured with his hand, saying that working with my uncle for so many years was good at first, but these last 2 years have gotten worse. He only cares about profit. He's arrogant, and when there are problems, he never admits his mistake, only makes excuses. With what happened at the wedding, it's become clear to him. Mr. Zhang said, "Sai, I've made a decision. From now on, all seafood for the restaurant will come from you. I have 2 locations and a volume of at least 200,000 weekly. Can you guarantee the supply?" "I can guarantee it. The source at the South Dock is stable and the quality is assured. Plus, I have professional cold chain distribution. Here is the partnership contract. It takes effect starting next month. With this order closed, the daily cash flow of my cold storage can stabilize above 300,000. I will completely surpass the peak level my uncle ever had. What kind of market am I opening?" On the way, I received several calls from owners who attended the wedding banquet, asking if I could supply them too. I noted their contacts one by one and set up appointments to visit them. Now, in the market, rumors are spreading that I secured the Hinding hotel order. From now on, my business will take off. At 8 p.m., standing in front of my warehouse, I looked at my uncle's stall across the way. The light was still on, but the interior was empty except for him sitting there. He had a pile of bills in front of him and wouldn't stop using the calculator. Marcus approached and, lowering his voice, said, "Boss, I heard your uncle went to beg Mr. Zhang for mercy today, but he wouldn't even let him in. Others say all the goods your uncle prepared for the banquet this time stayed on his hands. A loss of food quality, and the price of food has been dropping. A loss of at least 300,000. I said nothing. I simply lit a cigarette. This time my uncle is truly finished. He lost the biggest client, the Hinding Hotel. His payment chain has completely broken, added to the losses from the previous price war and the interest on predatory loans. He can't hold on any longer. In the market, people are already whispering that his stall won't make it to the end of the month. They also say his old freezers are now completely useless. They can't be fixed." The next day, I visited those owners I met at the banquet. They are owners of famous restaurants in the city and demand high quality in their seafood. I took them to the warehouse so they could see the goods. I explained the source at the South Dock and the distribution service in detail. They were all very satisfied. They signed the cooperation contract on the spot. Added to the Hinding hotel order, I now have 5 major restaurants. Long-term cooperation, with a weekly volume exceeding 400,000. Marcus said excitedly, "Boss, now we've really taken off." I looked at the contract in my hands and felt at peace. From 120,000 until now, in less than 2 months, I haven't just consolidated my position. I've secured the highest quality client resources in the market. That same afternoon, I went to the South Dock to talk to Old Chun and the others about the increase in supply. Old Chun said there was no problem, that they had 2 more boats ready to assign to guarantee supply stability. Returning to the market at dusk, I saw my uncle's stall. There was a group of creditors gathered at the door, shouting for him to pay them. My uncle was there, his hair disheveled and his face pale. He seemed to have aged 10 years. Marcus said, "Boss, I heard your uncle went to the bank today to ask for a loan, but they denied him. Now, the debts he's accumulated total more than $1 million. It's impossible for him to pay them." I didn't respond. I simply went back to the warehouse to keep working. Tomorrow another order must be closed, and we can't be late. After securing the Hinding hotel order, my warehouse's daily flow stabilized above 300,000, but I knew a few large restaurants weren't enough. The market retailers are the foundation. Only by integrating them all will I truly be able to control this market. That afternoon, I gathered a dozen market retailers I have a good relationship with. These are people I've worked with during this half year. I helped some by advancing money, others by solving supply problems. I served them tea and went straight to the point with my idea. I told them that competition is fierce, and it's hard to survive working on one's own. I want to establish a supply alliance centered on my cold storage to unify sourcing, pricing, and distribution. Join forces so we all benefit and share the profits. Several looked at each other, and someone asked how it would operate specifically. I said it's simple. First, supply will be managed centrally from here, guaranteeing the best quality and price. Distribution will be unified with my cold chain vehicles to reduce losses. Third, the profits and distribution. Profits will be split proportionally. I take 30% and you keep 70%. A retailer named John said, "Your idea is good, but why should we collaborate with you? What if you just use your supply advantage against us?" I replied, "John, we've worked together a long time. You should know my character. Besides, if I wanted to pressure you, I could do it right now. I created this alliance so everyone makes money, not to keep it all for myself." Another retailer asked, "What about your uncle? Even if he's not doing well now, he's been in this market for over 10 years. His connections are still there. If we work with you, will he retaliate? I told them they had nothing to fear. He can barely support himself now. How would he have the energy to deal with them? Besides, in business, what matters is capability, not connections. Several retailers deliberated for a moment and finally nodded. They said, "You're a fair person. We trust you." That same night, I signed the alliance agreement with John. Starting next week, all their supplies will come from me. Distribution will also be unified using my refrigerated trucks. I promise to guarantee a stable supply, the best prices, and zero losses. Marcus said excitedly, "Boss, with this, we've truly integrated the market. Once this buying and selling alliance starts working, I'll control most of the supply sources and commercial outlets in the market. My uncle's market share will be reduced even further, and his situation will become much more difficult." The alliance officially began operations. I brought a large batch of goods from the South Dock and distributed it evenly among the alliance members. The delivery trucks arrived exactly on schedule. Every batch arrived with zero losses. Upon receiving the goods, the retailers gave me thumbs up one after another, saying that working with me is different. Word soon spread through the market. I had formed a buying and selling alliance. More than a dozen retailers joined. Everyone supported each other, and business kept getting better. Upon hearing the news, my uncle's face looked even worse. His market share, which had already been reduced to a minimum by my actions, now lost all competitiveness after my integration with the retailers. Someone next to him said, "Now that we work with the new guy, the supply is stable and the prices are fair. Why would I go back to you?" I said nothing. I just kept minding my own business. That same afternoon, I got a call from Old Chun. He told me 2 more new boats had arrived at the South Dock, and the supply was even more abundant. He asked if I could increase my order volume. They had too much stock there and needed stable commercial outlets. I said it was no problem. Now, with the alliance, my sales channels were wide open. I could absorb any amount of goods. After hanging up, I stood by the cold storage door. Looking at my uncle's stall across the way, I realized there was a big problem. He was arguing with a creditor. The volume was very high. The creditor was pointing at his face, shouting that if he borrowed money, he had to pay it back and to stop making excuses. My uncle, his face flushed, tried to explain incessantly, asking for a few more days. He swore he'd find a way to pay, but the creditor didn't want to hear it and threatened him directly. "If you don't pay this week, I'll take you to court." Marcus approached and, lowering his voice, said, "Boss, I heard your uncle's debt already exceeds $1.5 million. Even if he mortgages his stall, it won't be enough to pay. He's truly in a dead end." Standing at the warehouse door, I observed the whole market. Everything was lit up, with people coming and going in a busy scene, while my uncle's stall looked strangely deserted. Marcus said, "Boss, now everyone in the market says you're the real boss here. Your uncle's era is over." I didn't respond. I just closed the cold storage door. Tomorrow, another batch of king crabs arrives. The alliance members have already reserved 500,000 in orders. This market is already mine. The alliance operated for 2 weeks, and everything went smoothly. My daily cash flow at the cold storage stayed stable above 400,000, and my market share already reached 60%. That afternoon, while doing inventory, Old Chin suddenly called with an urgent tone. He said the Weather Observatory issued a warning. A super typhoon was going to make landfall in 3 days, and all ships at sea had to return to port for shelter. This meant at least a week without fresh seafood supplies in the market. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately asked if they could still unload goods. Old Shin said today was the last day. Starting tomorrow, all boats had to be in port. He told me he still had 1 batch left and asked if I wanted it. I said I'd take it all and would head there immediately. After hanging up, I called Marcus. We headed straight to the South Dock in the refrigerated truck. While driving, I calculated that due to the typhoon, the market would run out of provisions and seafood prices would skyrocket. If I managed to stockpile enough goods in advance, I wouldn't just guarantee supply for the alliance members, I'd stabilize the market. I arrived at the South Dock at sunset. Old Chun and his team were urgently unloading goods. The dock was packed. I decided to buy everything on the spot and transferred the 300,000 immediately. Old Chun spoke up. "This typhoon is coming in strong. Prepare yourself well." I calculated there would be an interruption of at least a week and the market would be out of stock. I nodded, saying I had it under control. We transported the goods back to the market during the night. It was 11 p.m. when we finished. Marcus and I began sorting, packaging, and storing. I meticulously checked the cold storage's backup generator to ensure there would be no power failure during the typhoon. The next morning, rumors began to hit the market. The market began to fill with rumors about the storm. Many stall owners tried to stockpile stock urgently, but most boats had already returned to port. It was impossible to buy anything. Marcus said, "Boss, everyone in the market is desperate for goods and prices have already gone up 30%. I replied, "Don't worry. First, let's secure the supply for the alliance members, and then we'll see what to do with the surplus." I gathered the alliance members for a meeting. I told them the typhoon was approaching and the market would be out of supplies for a month. I told them they wouldn't run out of supplies because I had stockpiled enough in advance. I guaranteed their supplies wouldn't be affected and prices wouldn't rise. Several small traders sighed in relief. They said, "You really have vision. Otherwise, we all would have had to close." After the meeting, other stall owners started looking for me, wanting to buy goods at high prices, but I rejected them all, saying the priority was the alliance members. In the afternoon, I heard my uncle was also hoarding goods. Marcus told me my uncle had taken out predatory loans and bought a large batch of goods at high prices from small ports, hoping to make a fortune during the typhoon and recover. I felt my heart sink. My uncle was against the ropes, betting everything on a single card. But his old refrigeration machines would never withstand such a load. If something went wrong, the losses would be devastating. At sunset, I went specifically to see my uncle's stall. He was directing his workers to move the goods. He was moving them into the cold storage with a rare smile on his face. His refrigeration machines were running at maximum power, emitting a deafening roar. I stood across from him, watching those old machines with a sense of grim foreboding. Marcus approached and, lowering his voice, said, "Boss, the goods your uncle stockpiled must be worth at least 500,000. Can his old machines handle it?" I shook my head without saying anything. That night, I rechecked all the equipment in my cold storage. The refrigerators were working normally, and the temperature stayed stable at 5 degrees below zero. The backup generator tests were ready to go. I even prepared several small generators, just in case. At midnight, standing in front of the warehouse door, I looked at the sky. Black clouds were starting to gather, and the wind was picking up. The weather forecast indicated the typhoon would make landfall in the early morning of the day after tomorrow, with winds up to level 14. My uncle's stall across from mine was still lit up. Through the glass, I could see him sitting there alone in front of his goods, with a smile of expectation. He believed this typhoon was his chance for rebirth, not knowing it might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. The next day, the typhoon drew closer. The sky was leaden. The winds had already reached level 8, and many market stalls began to close early. To prepare for the storm, I asked Marcus to check all the equipment one more time to ensure nothing failed. The Alliance members also prepared to continue the test. The typhoon was approaching land, but operations couldn't continue after it hit. At 4 in the afternoon, I received a call from Old Chun, saying the typhoon was stronger than expected and to be very careful. His boats had already returned to port to be reinforced, and the dock was clear. I replied, "Don't worry, I'm well prepared." After hanging up, I stood in front of the cold storage, watching the sky darken and the wind blow harder. The first raindrops began to fall. At my uncle's stall, he was still working, but I noticed the screen on his refrigerator. Refrigerator number 3 started flickering and the temperature became unstable. I felt a pang. I knew that machine too well. It was a sign it was about to break down. The typhoon made landfall, and a gale with rain lashed the city. Street signs were ripped away, trees snapped in half, and the market was plunged into darkness, except for the emergency lights of a few stalls. Marcus and I kept watch over the cold storage, carefully monitoring the equipment. The cooling system was working normally, the temperature was stable, and the backup power source was ready at any moment. Marcus, leaning against the window looking out, suddenly said, "Boss, it looks like something happened at your uncle's stall." I walked over and looked ahead through the veil of rain. My uncle's stall was in dim light. All the refrigerators at his stall had stopped. My uncle was in the same position as me, moving back and forth inside with a flashlight. He was clearly looking for backup power, but he hadn't made any preparations. Marcus said, "Boss, if he stays without electricity, all the goods he has inside are going to spoil." I said nothing and kept guarding my equipment. The typhoon lasted 6 full hours. The wind and rain gradually subsided, the sky began to clear, and I stepped out of the cold storage. The market was a disaster, with dead seafood scattered everywhere on the ground. The rotten stench could be smelled from far away. Marcus said, "Boss, your uncle is finished. 6 hours without power, and all the cooling machines stopped. 500,000 in goods have spoiled." I went over to take a look. The king crabs, Australian lobsters, and star groupers had turned into a mass of rotting meat. My uncle sat there with a vacant stare, as if his soul had been ripped out. Seeing me, a flash of complex emotion crossed his gaze, but in the end, he said nothing. He simply lowered his head. I turned around and left without looking back. Returning to the warehouse, I began the inventory. 0 losses during the typhoon. All the seafood was alive. I immediately notified the Alliance members that we could supply normally. At 10 in the morning, the market began to resume activity, but most stalls had suffered heavy losses from the power outage and had no goods to sell. In the whole market, only my warehouse was still operating normally. Soon, the market became a place of life again. The only place with stock was icy food. Buyers from major restaurants called one after another asking if I could supply them. I said yes, but prices would follow the market trend. After the typhoon, seafood was scarce. Prices have gone up. Allies have priority and keep their prices. For other customers, the market price. That day, my warehouse was packed. Restaurant owners, retailers, and even other stall owners came looking for goods. I supplied on a first-come, first-served basis. I stayed at the market, ensuring each customer received their share without hoarding or speculating. Marcus said excitedly, "Boss, today's turnover has exceeded 1 million. I said nothing. It wasn't the result I was looking for, but that's the law of the market. Those who prepare, survive. Those who don't, are eliminated. At 3 in the afternoon, several creditors arrived at my uncle's stall. Seeing that pile of dead seafood, they turned livid. One of them pointed at my uncle and shouted, "Old Lee, how are you going to pay us back? How much can all this trash be worth?" My uncle stood there with his head down, repeating incessantly for them to give him a little more time, that he'd find a way to pay. The creditors didn't listen and said directly that if he didn't pay in 3 days, they would sue him in court. They would seize his stall. My uncle seemed to have lost all his strength and leaned against the wall. He couldn't articulate a word. Marcus said, "Boss, your uncle lost his 500,000 in goods and owes over $1 million. He'll never recover." I stood at the door. I stood at the warehouse door, observing the situation across the way, feeling nothing inside. That night, the typhoon ended completely and the sky cleared. I stood at the market entrance looking at the starry sky. This typhoon has completely changed the structure of the market. At my uncle's stall across from me, the light was still on. He sat there alone in front of that pile of rotten seafood, motionless. Those cooling machines were totally useless. The screens were black and beyond repair. In the market, people began to whisper that my uncle was totally finished. He bet everything before the typhoon. He took out predatory loans to stockpile goods, and suddenly, it all went to hell. Now, not only can he not recover, but he has even more debt. The next day, Old Chin called. He said that after the typhoon, the boats have started going out to fish, and in 3 days there will be new goods at the port. He asked how much I needed. I told him to prepare double the usual amount. There's a shortage in the market now. Demand is high. After hanging up, I stood in front of the cold storage entrance. Observing the whole market, I saw that after the typhoon, many stalls were cleaning up their losses. Some have even closed their doors, but in my cold storage, business is better than ever. That afternoon, I was inside the cold storage doing inventory of the new goods. Marcus approached and said, "Boss, your uncle is at the door. He says he wants to see you." I looked up and saw my uncle through the glass. Standing outside, his hair was a mess and his face was distorted and red. He looked truly haggard. Seeing me, his lips trembled. After a long moment, he managed to utter 2 words, "Help me." I lit a cigarette. I said nothing, waiting for him to speak. My uncle was silent for a good while. Finally, he said, "I have to ask you a favor. Could you lend me some money?" I looked at him without responding. My uncle continued, "The night of the typhoon, all my goods spoiled. Now the creditors come daily. They say they'll take me to court. I'm in a dead end. Couldn't you help your uncle, considering we're family?" I flicked the ash from my cigarette and said calmly, "Uncle, how much do you owe?" My uncle, looking down, said, "With interest, 1.6 million. I told him, 1.6 million is not a small amount. My uncle looked up, his eyes reddening, and said, "I know I failed you in the past, the thing with the 120,000. It was my mistake. Now that your business is so big, 1.6 million means nothing to you. Lend it to me, and I assure you I'll pay it back." I looked at him and said, "Uncle, what are you going to pay with?" My uncle froze and replied, "I still have that stall. Even if it's not worth much now, the location is still good. When I recover, I'll return the capital with interest." I smiled and told him, "Uncle, do you really think you can recover?" My uncle was left speechless by my question. His face was red with shame. I continued, "Before the typhoon, the weather station issued warnings. Everyone knew they should prepare backup generators. You didn't prepare, and in a desperate act, you took out predatory loans to hoard goods. That was your own choice. Now that things have gone wrong, you come to ask me for money? By what right?" My uncle said, "We're family." I replied, "Uncle, when you were splitting the profits, you didn't treat me like family. For 365 days a year, I sacrificed myself working for you. You gave me 120,000 saying I was just labor to you. Now that you have problems, you suddenly remember we're family?" My uncle stood there mute, as if all his strength had been drained. I put out the cigarette and said, "Uncle, I can help you, but not by lending you money." My uncle's eyes lit up and he said, "Tell me, as long as I can get through this crisis, I'll accept any condition." I told him, "Transfer your stall to me, and I'll put up 1.6 million to help you settle all your debts." My uncle was stunned, saying nothing for a long time. I made him see that the stall is now just an empty shell and the cooling systems are useless. The customers are gone too. Even if he doesn't transfer it to me, the creditors will seize it through the court. Instead of it being seized, it's better to sell it to me. At least that way he can settle his debts and avoid going to jail. My uncle's face turned pale and, with trembling lips, he said, "That stall is the fruit of 10 years of my effort." I pointed out that effort doesn't pay debts. Now he only has 2 options. Either he transfers the stall to me, settles his debts, and starts from scratch, or he waits to be sued, has the stall seized, and ends up in jail. Choose for yourself. My uncle froze there, looking at me with fury in his eyes. There was resentment, but in the end, it all turned into helplessness. He said, "Can you raise the price a little?" I shook my head, indicating that 1.6 million is the market price. Given the current condition of his stall, it's already quite good that it's worth that much. My uncle was silent for a long time. My uncle was left with nothing. 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 He was completely drained. Completely drained. A new reality. Everything was over. In a short time, he was finished. From his peak to rock bottom. In a short time, he was finished. The new debt was a mountain he couldn't climb. It was a technical knockout. He was trapped. They were all watching. The end had arrived. I stood inside, looking at the sign of the new warehouse, with a complex look in my eyes. I walked over. I stood by his side without saying a word. My uncle looked at me. After a long silence, he finally spoke. He said, "Take care of it. Do a good job." With that, he turned around and walked away. He no longer had the fire of the stall owner he used to be, back when I had 120,000. Since then, In less than 3 months, I achieved a total counteroffensive, the largest stall in the market, the most stable supply source, and the highest quality customers. Everything is in my hands. This market is mine now. The year is ending. This year, since I started with 120,000 after the breakup, to controlling the entire market, it feels like a lifetime. That night, I gathered all the employees and alliance members. We set up more than 10 tables at the new stall. Leo, Old Chun, Old Wayne, and Old Joe were all there. The 13 retailers, everyone who followed me, the whole team that fought by my side is here. I stood up, raised my glass, and said, "Thank you all for your support this year. Today is the day to hand out the year-end bonuses, and I'm keeping my word." Linda was the first to receive her share. I handed her a red envelope with 200,000 inside. Her starting salary was 12,000 a month, and I promised her a year-end bonus if she did a good job. That 200,000 is what she deserves. The 13 retailers also received their share, as agreed. The profit split was 80 to 20. They took the lion's share. Each one received hundreds of thousands, some even more than 1 million. Linda and the retailers were so excited. They couldn't even speak. Before, working for others, they killed themselves all year and barely made 100,000. After working a few months with me, they earned more than in several previous years. I said, "If you all follow me, I won't let you down. Let's keep working hard next year. It will be even better." Old Chun and the other ship captains also came to the city. I prepared a generous gift for each of them. "Thank you for your support this year." Old Chun patted me on the shoulder and said, "Alex, you're a loyal and brave kid. We weren't wrong about you." After several drinks, the atmosphere grew warmer and warmer. Some retailers started reminiscing about these past months. They talked about how at first, no one in the market trusted me. They thought that I, being so young, couldn't beat my uncle. But who would have imagined that in just a few months, the situation would be completely reversed? The banquet ended. It was already very late. I was standing in front of the stall when Linda approached and handed me a ledger. She said that from the opening until now, the total cash flow is 23 million and the net profit is 8.5 million. I took the book and flipped through the numbers. Last year, working all year for my uncle, the total cash flow was over 5 million. The net profit was 2.85 million and I only received 120,000. This year, working on my own, for less than 3 months, the net profit is 8.5 million. This year, the net profit was 3 times higher than last year. I learned many lessons this year. Rules only matter if you hold them in your hands. The capital was his. The relationships were his. That's why he made the calls. Now the stall is mine. The supply is mine. The customers are mine. I decide, but I won't be like my uncle, who only cared about exploiting me. In the end, he ended up alone and betrayed. What I must do is allow those who follow me to also make money. Only then can we go further. Linda tells me, my uncle is now working in the kitchen of a small restaurant. Going from owning a stall to being an employee, that contrast isn't something just anyone can handle. But it was his own choice, based on how he treated me back then. This is his harvest. At midnight, I close the stall door. The New Year's bells are about to ring, and in the market, they start lighting firecrackers. I stand under the sign for Alex's Aquatic Products Wholesale, looking at this 1,000 square meter stall, looking at those 6 new refrigeration machines, looking at the 5 cold chain trucks parked at the entrance. From 120,000 to 8.5 million. From being an exploited employee to the market's largest supplier, it took me less than 3 months. This year, I learned the most important thing. Rules only give you true confidence when they are in your own hands. Linda approaches and says, "Boss, Happy New Year." I smiled and said, "Happy New Year." In the distant sky, fireworks begin to bloom, their colored lights illuminating the whole world. I stand at the stall entrance, watching everything with a calm heart. Next year, I want to grow even more. I don't just want this market, I want to expand to nearby cities, and even further. But for now, I just want to go home, to have New Year's Eve dinner with my mother. I take out my phone and send her a message. "Mom, I'm coming home tomorrow." The phone buzzes quickly. "Okay, Mom will be waiting." I put my phone away, lock the stall door, and drive out of the market. In the rearview mirror, the sign for Alex's Aquatic Products Wholesale fades away.